Hello, everybody. I'm going to have a look at Rime of the Dead Self by A.R.D. Fairburn. So, I don't think there's a huge amount of historical context or personal context to be looking at, but A.R.D. Fairburn lived from 1904 to 1957 and was from New Zealand. Something that might seem relevant is that he lectured in the theory of art at Auckland University College. So he seems to take an interest in art and the things that might inspire a person. And I think maybe that's relevant to this poem because it's about someone looking back at their younger self and seeing them as possibly overly romantic or fixating on the wrong things, thinking about the wrong things. So that might seem relevant, but like I say, I don't think historical context is hugely important, and rather we should jump straight into the poem. So the poem Rime of the Dead Self is very clearly about someone looking back at their younger self and being angry. Angry at the way they were, angry at the things that their younger self spent their time thinking about. And actually, in the poem, the speaker enacts acts of violence, strangles their younger self. So it's quite an extreme poem, I would say. The sense of violence in the poem against the younger self is created through this semantic field. I've underlined here some of the words that are used to describe violence: strangled, choked, catching him, dragged out, he is dead. All of these words combine to create a clear sense of the violence the speaker wants to enact against their younger self. And it's quite shocking for us as a reader. The poem begins with the word tonight. Now, the night time is a time for sinister and evil things to take place, but it's also the end of the day, and therefore, this might reflect the fact that this is an older person who's approaching the end, the final stages of their life, looking back at their younger self. So, there's a kind of double symbolism of the fact that the poem is taking place tonight. It also creates a sense of urgency to harm the younger person's self. Now, I'm going to go and look at some language. I'm going to zoom in on these three quatrains, meaning 4-line stanzas. But one thing I would say about the structure of the poem is that you might notice the use of alternating rhyme scheme. So the first and third lines rhyme, and then the second and fourth lines rhyme. Okay, it's not always perfect, but you can clearly pick out this alternating rhyme scheme: A B A B C D C D E F E F. Now, what this does is it separates the rhyming lines from one another. The lines don't come next to each other, they are separated. And I think this reflects the speaker's intended separation of his younger self from his present self. So I think there's a kind of theme of separation created through the rhyme scheme, the alternate rhyme scheme, and that forms part of structure. And what I try and do is add that on to the end of one of your paragraphs. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump into the first quatrain. There's lots you can say, but I've tried to pick out the key points. He describes his younger self as a pale, lily-white lad. So the word lad is an informal term for a young person. So he's drawing attention to how young this former self is, but the color imagery used to describe him is quite clear. He's pale. He's lily white. Now, the colour of whiteness, of paleness, is used to make this younger self seem cowardly, I think. When people are scared, they're often described as white as a sheet. I think there's a sense that that younger person is a coward, is cowardly. The other way to look at this colour imagery, from my point of view, is that there's a suggestion of purity, of innocence that comes with the colour white. And perhaps that's part of the younger self's naivety. They're innocent to certain facts, and that's created through colour imagery. So If you could pick out this quote and identify the technique of colour imagery, you might then have two alternative interpretations to work with in your essay. The animalistic imagery of claws. The speaker says, my hands, and then he says, these claws. Now, of course, animals have claws, so the animalistic imagery of claws shows just how violent he's capable of being. He can act like an animal here. He can be as vicious as an animal with his claws, and claws catching him. You'll see the repetition of that hard k sound, and that's guttural alliteration. The hard sounds that come from the diaphragm, the guttural alliteration of claws catching, that's a harsh sound. That harsh sound perhaps reflects the harshness with which he acts. So these claws catching him, for me, good quote to be zooming in on. I'd then talk about the way that he describes his younger self as lying or dreaming in bed. He clearly sees his younger self as this romantic figure who's completely detached from reality. Some of us have to go to work and have real responsibilities, but his younger self seems to have the luxury of lying in bed, dreaming of things that are inconsequential. So I think there's that verb dreaming is interesting. It seems to present this view of his younger self as romantic in a bad way. Looking at the second stanza, a few things I might pick up on. He describes himself chuckling whilst he drags out his younger self's brains. Now, this is an extremely violent act, and yet he laughs, he chuckles whilst doing it. This tells me that he feels no remorse. In fact, he might be quite sadistic. So to be sadistic means to enjoy inflicting pain on someone. So he seems to be sadistic. And that might tell us that he is somewhat psychotic. He feels no empathy or guilt for this act of extreme violence. We get a sense in this quatrain that the thing that he particularly objects to about his younger self is how much he thinks about romantic love. He describes his younger self as full of pretty love tales, and he talks about dreams of love, oh, what ruinous folly. So he clearly has a problem with romance and thoughts of love. Love is described as ruinous. It will ruin you. Folly. It is a mistake. So he clearly objects to this, suggesting perhaps the speaker has previously been hurt by love or has some reason to resent love in some way. The last thing I talk about in this quatrain is the fact that he empties the younger person's brains into the drain. Now, the drain is used for sewage, waste, disposing of things that are therefore worthless, disgusting. And so that's how he sees his younger self: worthless, disgusting, waste. So he's clearly has quite a lot of disgust with his younger self. Looking at this final stanza, this final quatrain, I'd focus on three things. Firstly, he personifies his younger self as he. He sees that younger self as another person through personification. And that tells me that there's a distance between his present self and his younger self. That younger self is literally a separate person to himself. So that's personification. The second thing, and I think this allusion potentially gives you some really high-level analysis, he says that his younger self shall not rise on the third day. So this seems to be quite clearly an allusion to Jesus Christ, who rose on the third day. So he denies his younger self this association with Jesus. Now, I can read two things into this, and perhaps it's up to you to choose one or present both within your essay. Maybe his younger self thought that he was as good as or close to as good as Jesus himself. So perhaps there's a messianic complex in his younger self. His younger self thought he was the Messiah, the next coming. And that's why here he says, nope, that's not going to happen. You are not Jesus Christ, I'm afraid. The other thing the other angle I might take is that he's presenting himself as satanic in some ways here by denying this messianic rising on the third day. He presents this kind of opposition force to good and therefore presents himself in this sort of satanic and evil way. The last thing I would talk about is this simile, sloughed like a snake skin. So a snake will shed its skin, and another verb to describe this shedding is sloughing. So this process of sloughing like a snake skin, it's like the speaker has actually taken off their younger self like a snake skin. They've completely removed their younger self from their present self. So there's a sense of a complete detachment of those two personas. The last thing I'd say is the use of sibilants within this quote. So sloughed like a snake's skin. So that S sound appears 3 times, and that seems to have a serpentine connotation. That means it seems to make the reader think of something like a snake. Our snakes have, for biblical reasons, connotations of evil. So again, he might be presenting himself, his present self, as this quite evil figure. It's up to you to choose one or both of these alternative interpretations, but you will be rewarded serious marks if you can present 2 different ways of looking at the same piece of evidence.